Hi, this is Glenn Dawson, and on May the 12th of this year, Linda and I took a trip with folks from the Lexington Community Seniors. We went over to the Cain Meeting House. That's a really, really old church uh, back in the 17 and 1800s. It was uh, real active, and a great revival took place there. Um, After we visited the park, we went over to Blue Licks State Park, where we had a wonderful meal. We hope you enjoy these videos and photos of our trip down there. Comment below if you'd like to. Thank you very much.
So how are the pews? We should never complain about our pews. Wow.
She's already been in here.
I know that, but I got something for her.
He wore a hat like that. That's
I'm Betty Allman. This is my 19th year here at Cain Ridge. I was not here when they built the church. A lot of people seem to think I was, but I was not. I'm not quite that old. I'm getting there, but not quite. The meeting house was built in 1791. Daniel Boone had become friendly in Pennsylvania with a Presbyterian minister by the name of Robert Finley. Can all of you hear me? I've got a lot of sinus problems this morning, and my voice isn't carrying as well. And the Presbyterian minister, Robert Finley, moved on to North Carolina to a Presbyterian church. And Daniel Boone, of course, was in and out of Kentucky continuously. But he wrote to Finley in 1790 and said, "Come west. There's this marvelous ridge covered with cane, and there's everything from rabbits to buffalo within the cane, and trees everywhere." And that's how Cain Ridge gets its name, because this ridge starts and comes this way, curves around into the next county, and is 12, 14, 15 miles long. The high point of it is in the field right next to the fence up here. It was also Cherokee and Shawnee Indian hunting ground because of all of the animals that were here. But Finley brought a large group of Scots-Irish Presbyterians from North Carolina, and they're the ones who built the meeting house in 1791. The logs are blue ash. The building itself is 50 by 30. It's an unusually large meeting house for 1791. When they built the meeting house, because of the Indians, do you all know what chinking is? All right. They did not put the chinking in between the logs, and they did not cut the windows. And that way you can see that's lit. According to where you were seated, you could see out all four walls. The gallery was built for slaves. 1791 was a time of slavery here. There were no inside steps when it was built. The slaves entered by a series of ladders outside this door up to a platform and came through that opening up there. But by 1832, we're not real sure what year, but by, 1829, the gallery was gone, and the slaves were moved downstairs to worship with the others. This is the original 1791 gallery. It was taken out in large sections, and it was taken to a farm, and not too far from here. And the family who owned the farm were members here. It was there for over 100 years before it was brought and put back in the meeting house. And each generation was told, this is the gallery that belongs in the old Cain Ridge meeting house. The first floor was dirt. The first pew was just a pungent log, and that's the log sawn in two, rounded side down, flat side up, and 4 little legs. We have a replica of one right outside that window. Then in 1832, they said they wanted to update and beautify the church. So they put in a puncheon floor. And we have it's 1828 or 1829, I just lost the date too long, but it's on the pew that's out there. They had new pews. The one that's out there is so tall, your feet will not touch the floor. And there's a lot of discussion here about why it is so tall. And I said, I'm an old farm gal, and any carpenter I ever knew had a saw. And if he made it too tall, he'd have sawed the legs off. I had a gentleman in here about 5 years ago who'd been to England and out in the countryside to a real old church. And he said the back pew was taller than the others, so the people in the back pew could see over their heads. I'm a majority of one here at Cambridge that thinks that's what that is, a back pew, because they were not taller than we are. My understanding is in 1791 and on, they were shorter. So I think that's a back pew, but I haven't convinced everyone yet. They also enlarged the windows and put glass in them. And that's the reason they look like they've been patched. They put some sort of covering on the wall. We're not sure what, because a lot of the things we disagree about what the covering was. Then in 1882, this tongue and groove floor came, and it was put right on top of the puncheon floor. These pews came in 1882. The pump organ came in 1882. But this is an 1880 pump organ. The original one disappeared while the church was closed. I've heard at least 5 different stories about what happened to the pump organ. They're all different. I don't think anyone really knows what happened to it. But some friends in Montgomery County gave Cambridge this 1880 pump organ, and we do use it. It has a beautiful sound. Then in 1882, they closed the east door, took down the raised pulpit, and the low pulpit that's in the museum was used here in front, and they turned all the pews around and made the center aisle. And also, for the first time, they had heat. And it was a pot-bellied stove, and it sat back where those marks are on the floor. You do know what a pot-bellied stove is? I had a large group of 4th graders in here, and I said pot-bellied stove, and I got all these blank looks. And finally, one child said, "What's that?" Have you ever tried to describe a pot-bellied stove? Then they were just full of questions about it. 4th graders do not know what a pot-bellied stove is.
A lot of things that I
But it was sat right where those marks are. 1921 was the last full-time church here. All the little towns had grown up. They had lots of churches, and Cane Ridge was down to a few of the elderly. And when one of the elderly ladies died, they decided it was time to close. And so in 1921, it closed as a full-time church. And I'm going to finish about the building, then I'll go back to the religious part. 1932, the Disciples churches, because I will tell you, it started Presbyterian when it was built. When it closed, it was a Christian church, Disciples of Christ. They decided that they wanted to open King Ridge up. Oh, and they had put a clapboard on the outside in 1829. That's what saved the logs, was the clapboard. So 1932, they brought the gallery back, took the ceiling out, took the heat out. We haven't had any heat since. And believe me, it gets cold here in October, and it's cold here in April when we start. I keep 4 drawers full of Afghans out there. So if you get cold, I'll run and get you one. They turned the pews back around. They rebuilt the raised pulpit from drawings, diagrams, and pictures of the raised pulpit. And they added the inside steps. They put the windows back, pardon? It was 1932. And they took the glass out of the windows and put them back to the original size. Then the woodpeckers in weather, when they took the clapboard off, began to destroy the logs. The experts first told them to paint it with a preservative. They did that several times, and it did not work. Finally, the experts told them, if you do not put something over it, it's going to slowly deteriorate and fall in. The superstructure, as we call it for lack of a better name, was started in 1957 and dedicated in 1959 to the tune of just a little over $100,000. We call it a native Cain Ridge limestone because it's golden in color. Limestone, you know, usually has a bluish or whitish cast. This is golden, and it was found within just a 6-mile radius. Then later on, they built the curator's home, and that's his home over here. And in the 70s, they built the museum and the little gift shop and the office and the restaurants. Now, going back to Robert Finley, who was the first Presbyterian minister here. Finley was a very well-educated man. He graduated from the university that later became Princeton University. But he was asked to leave Cain Ridge. It states in the records that he was seen by some members of his congregation unable to sit his horse. He had been drinking. But isn't that a nice way to put it? Yes, you know, we say, oh, he was drunk. But I think that's such a kind way to say he was unable to sit his horse. So he was asked to leave Cain Ridge, and he left here and went to Ohio, and part of the congregation went with him. But from things we have read, he had a drinking problem for the rest of his life. Barton Warren Stone, this is his portrait. Please forgive me, but I've got sinuses. Barton Warren Stone came here in 1796 as a licensed Presbyterian minister. There were things about the Presbyterian church that he disagreed with. Now, all churches come here, and we do not want to offend anyone. So we're very careful about the things we say with the spirits, because we do not want to offend anyone. The only things I mention when I talk to groups about the things what Barton Stone disagreed with the Presbyterians about were they sprinkled infants. He thought child should be old enough to know what they were doing. They had closed communion at that time. Now, do you all know what closed communion is?
Sure enough.
And they only had it once a year. And a week or two before time for communion, they would announce we're going to have communion on a certain Sunday. And during that time, you would meet either with the minister or with someone he appointed. And that decided whether you received a token to say you were worthy of communion. And if you came to the communion table without that token, you would be turned away. Cain Ridge was under the Transylvania Presbytery Board in Lexington. That was another thing Barton Stone disagreed with. He thought each church should be able to control itself, rather than some board off somewhere that really did not know the congregation. There were other reasons, but I will not go into it, because some of them may be Presbyterians, and I do not know. And the Presbyterian Church in Paris comes here every year for our worship service. They have a big picnic, and I love picnics because I love to eat. Barton Stone finally, in 1796, was, or in 1798, was ordained. You had to accept the Westminster Confession of Faith at that time to be ordained as a Presbyterian minister. He told them ahead of time, when they asked him if he would accept the Westminster Confession of Faith, that his answer would be, as long as I see that it follows the teachings of the Bible. A lot of people say that was almost like saying no, but they agreed to accept it, and he was ordained here in 1798. In 1799, revivals moved down the East Coast, and they came into Tennessee, and they came into Kentucky, from Tennessee into western Kentucky. Did I tell you that this was Virginia when the meeting house was built? You know, Kentucky did not become a state until 1792. Barton Stone went to several of the revivals. He liked what he saw, he liked what he heard, and he decided to have a revival here. And he planned it for August of 1801. And it was to last a week, and it was to end with their yearly communion. The military estimated between 20 and 30,000 people here on the ridge during that week of revival. I call them come and go. People would come to the revival, but of course they had to bring their cows for milk, They had to bring their food, they had to bring their feed for their horses. And if they ran out of food for themselves or for their animals, they'd have to go home. If they are on a business or a farm, they had to go back to. And if they could, they'd come back. And that's the reason I say come and go. The reason the military estimated the crowd here was because this was a dropping off point going west in 1801. When you got here, it was just no civilization on. And not more than 5% of the people here on the western frontier had any affiliation with a church. And that's the reason these revivals, it was just so startling that they were just everywhere. Martin Stone invited the Baptist and Methodist ministers in this area to come and preach. That did not sit well with the Presbyterian board in Lexington. They preached out on the grounds from logs, wagon beds, platforms. The only thing I have read, can you all hear me up there? Okay. The only thing I have read about the meeting house itself, it said that it was used for the ministers to be renewed and refreshed. And I gather that means to sleep, because they preached 24 hours a day for a week. And you would have 5, 6, 7, maybe as many as 8, and they all preached at the same time. One didn't preach and finish, and you moved to the next one. They all preached at once. So you have thousands of people here. They didn't go anywhere without their dogs. They had the horses for transportation. They had the milk, the cows for milk. Lots of children, adults, 7 and 8 preachers out there all preaching 24 hours a day. There was a lot of singing, a lot of dancing. That did not sit well with the Presbyterian board either. There was what they called the jerks, and they described that as people would go forward until their head would almost touch the ground in front, and then backwards until their head would almost touch the ground. And it said no one was ever harmed during the exercises. I'll guarantee you, if I went backwards till my head touched the ground in the back, I'd be harmed in some way. But they would faint and stay on the ground for an hour or two at a time, just like they were dead, not moving, and suddenly jumping up saying they found God or they've been forgiven their sins. A lot of things like that, they call them exercises, went on. The Presbyterian board didn't like any of it. One thing I read, and I have only found it in one place, said that Martin Stone invited the Methodists and the Baptists to join them in communion. How he planned to do it, I cannot find out, because they had closed communion, and the Baptists at that time had closed communion. So I can't find out if anyone accepted and had communion with them or not. I don't know. But when the revival was over, Martin Stone and at least 5 or 6 other Presbyterian ministers who preached here during the revival were called before the Presbyterian board in Lexington. And they were asked to explain what happened here, what went on at the Cain Ridge Presbyterian Church. These interviews, talks, whatever you want to call them, went on for months. And finally, these Presbyterian ministers realized they were about to be asked to cease preaching from the Presbyterian pulpit until they had a change of heart and came back into the fold, as they put it. Now, not to leave the church, I want to make that clear, just cease preaching from the pulpit. So they decided before that happened, they would withdraw. And they started a group called the Springfield Presbytery. The best I can find out, it lasted less than 9 months. They said they were sticking too close to the things they disagreed with. So they wrote the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery. There's a copy out here on the wall. We sell copies in the gift shop. I cannot quote it, but somewhere in it, it says something like, "We will this body be dead and buried in the body of Christ, because there is only one body and one church." Now, that's not the exact words, but that's the best I can quote, but it's not that long. I can't quote it all. Martin Stone said in 1804, "I'm going to start a church. We'll be called Simply Christian. I will preach strictly from the Bible, and each church will govern itself." That tells you some of the things that he was against. He offered to leave Cain Ridge and start his church somewhere else. But this congregation voted to become a Christian church with Barton Warren Stone as their minister. It took them 3 years to decide what form of baptism. Now, they'd all been sprinkled. They said they did not go into it lightly, that after a lot of prayer, a lot of discussion, a lot of Bible reading, they decided on immersion. And they were baptized in Stoner Creek. Did you all come through Paris? All right, you came down Main Street, and you came under a railroad trestle and across the bridge. That's Stoner Creek. And as you came across, up on the right, there is a dam. It was not there in 1807. There's no plaque there, there's no sign there, but all of these years, the word is passed down that where that dam is where they were baptized. People come and ask me if the baptistry's back here, and I keep saying it was Presbyterian when it was built. And they want to know what that's for, and I told them, the only thing I know, it was so the minister could get a breeze. I don't know what it's for, but that's because he had to stand up there. And it does get pretty hot in here in the summertime, and it gets cold in there. Barton Stone left here after a while, and he ended up finally, he was in Georgetown for good many years. He finally ended up in Jacksonville, Illinois. He was in very poor health in 1844. He no longer had a full-time church. He would go out on what he called preaching missions. And he had a daughter living in Hannibal, Missouri. And he went into Missouri on a preaching mission, became quite ill, and got back to her house in Hannibal, and that's where he died in 1844. He was buried, when he was here, he had a little farm, it's about 5 miles down the road. You know, they didn't pay ministers much in those days, and still don't. But, excuse me, I'm sorry about my voice, you all. He had a little farm outside of Jacksonville. His first wife died while he was here. She was buried out there next to him, his first wife, and he had remarried. His second wife sold the farm in less than a year of his death, and his body was moved to a church cemetery in Jacksonville. In less than 3 years of his death, he was brought back here. He always said he wanted his bones to rest at King Ridge because he loved King Ridge better than anywhere. But he's been buried 3 times. I tell him he's well buried and he's here to stay. And his third life was over. And as you face it and look to the left, that smaller ledger stone is his first wife's. And when they moved her body, they brought it and they weighed it, and it weighed over 1,600 pounds. And it's not the largest of the ledger stones out here. Now they are solid limestone. Burial is in the ground just like it is now. And these are solid limestone, and they're very heavy. A lady told me one day I needed to straighten one up, and I said, not in my lifetime, I'm sure, because they're just too heavy, and they do not. But the graveyard is full. It starts at the sidewalk, goes all the way to the fence and around the back, and it is full. We know that. But there is only a partial list of who was buried there. You know, some of them may have had a wooden cross, and it was just lost down through the years. Some of them may not have had anything. I don't know. But to get back to Barton Stone, you've heard of Alexander Campbell and Thomas Campbell? Okay. Well, let's, excuse me, take my sinus back with you. People come here and ask me if this is a Campbellite church. And I say, well, not exactly. And I asked them if they heard of Stonites and Ulites. That's what Barton Stone's group were called. And not always in a nice way. Sometimes it was used as sort of an insult. But in 17, I'm terrible dates today. I'm sorry, my sinuses have just left my brain. 1707, Thomas Campbell came into America. He was a Presbyterian minister when he landed here. 1809, 1709. I'll get it right, you all, forgive me. I turned 86 Sunday, so you'll have to forgive me. It's old age. But in 1807, Thomas Campbell came into America. 1809, his son Alexander followed him from Scotland where he'd been in school. And when Alexander landed here, he was a Presbyterian minister. So Barton Stone had the Christian movement up and going before the Campbells arrived in America. But they, like Stone, were very much against some of the things the Presbyterian Church stood for. So shortly after arriving here, they split with the Presbyterian Church. And for a while, they were affiliated with a group of Baptists called the Redstone Baptists. But that didn't last long. The Baptists disagreed with the Campbells, and the Campbells disagreed with the Baptists, and they parted ways. Eventually, they settled in what is now Bethany, West Virginia. At that time, it was Bethany, Virginia, and everything coming down the East Coast was Virginia. And they started a group called Disciples, preaching the same thing that Barton Warren Stone was preaching here in Kentucky. Finally, well, Alexander came into Kentucky a lot. He was a great debater. He would come into Lexington not only for religious purposes, but for debates in Lexington. But finally, their followers said, you all are preaching the same thing Barton Stone is preaching. We're new here on the western frontier. If we would join forces, we would become a much stronger movement here. You know, these other churches, the Presbyterians, the Catholics, the Lutherans, the Baptists, the Methodists, came here with them from Europe and wherever they came. This Christian movement, this Christian church was new. And let me make it clear, I know all denominations are Christian. So if I say something about Christian denominations, I know they're all Christian. I haven't lived this long without finding it out. But I understand they don't like for you to say denomination anymore. But I can't find out why I'm not supposed to say it. So forgive me. I don't mean to offend you, but I'm used to saying denomination. So in 1832, in the old Hill Street Christian Church in Lexington, and it's no longer there, and it is a church that Barton Warren Stone had started, they had the handshake joining the disciples and the Christians. Now, a lot of people say that the Campbells were pushed into it, that they were not, especially Alexander. Now, he was at least 20 years younger than Barton Stone. Alexander's father, Thomas, thought more like Barton Stone did because they were more of the same age. But Raccoon John Smith represented the Campbell's disciples for the handshake, and Barton Stone represented his Christians. And that was in 1832 in the old Mill Street Christian Church in Lexington. And that they had to have a name meant for this church. Campbell thought it should be called Disciples. Barton Stone thought it should have Christian somewhere. So they compromised. That's when it became Christian Church Disciples of Christ. That's when the DOC was added on the end and caused a good deal of confusion, and I think sometimes it still does. We have a lot of people come here from foreign countries, and a lot of them are confused when they see the marquees in churches and it says DOC. They want to know, what does that mean? The first split came with Church of Christ. The only thing I mentioned about that split, it was over the interpretation of the scriptures. There were other reasons, but you've got to go home and find it out for yourself, because that's the only one I'm going to mention. Then they split into a cappella and instrumental. Now, I have tried to find when the original one first split, and I hadn't found it. And so I had a group here, about 10 years ago, from down south. I thought it was Georgia, but I'm not sure. And they were Church of Christ, and their minister was with them. And he told me, he said, I can tell you when it was listed as Church of Christ, separate from the Disciples Church. He asked me if I'd ever heard of David Lipscomb. Now, there is the David Lipscomb College. I think it's in Nashville. I keep wanting to say Knoxville, but it's Nashville. And they have dropped, I understand they've dropped the David and it just says Lipscomb College. I had heard of David Lipscomb, but when this minister asked me, I just couldn't think, where had I heard of him? And he said, well, he was a Church of Christ minister. And in 1907, there was a census being taken. And that David Lipscomb told the census taker, you list us, Church of Christ, separate from the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. Now, I was told that by a Church of Christ minister, so I'm just passing on what he said. Then came the split of the independent Christian church. Now, the one thing I remember about that split was the missionary program was a big part of it. Now, there were other reasons, just like these other splits, but that's the only one I'm going to mention. If you want to know, go home and look it up. Or ask him, is there a minister here? Gee, you're, okay. Yeah, that's fine, you're a minister. You're a minister. I get in trouble with ministers a lot of times, so I usually ask before I start, are there any ministers in the crowd? But they come here. Now this church is where the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ Instrumental, Church of Christ Acapella, and the Independent Christian Church all started here in 1804 with Barton and Warren Stone. And some of them come here and call it the Mother Church. And I will have to tell you this, a lot of funny things do happen. I had a big group in here. This section was full and this section was full. And I was sort of in the middle of my talk, and this gentleman walked in about halfway and stopped. Well, I'd say he was a good 6 feet tall. And I stopped to tell him, I said, please come and join us, and when I finish, I'll go back and tell you about the beginning. And all of a sudden he yelled, the Mother Church! Just like, I mean, he screamed. They looked at me with their eyes that big, and this group looked at me. I thought they were all going to go out the door. And I thought, why did he say that? And he very quietly went over and sat down. And that night I kept thinking, and then I thought, it is the Mother Church. And that made me realize it, but he really did emphasize it. He'd like to scare all of them to death. But we're open from the 1st of April to the last day of October, 7 days a week. There are 2 of us on staff here, the curator, James Trader, and myself. We average somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 visitors a year here during that 7 months. And they come from all over the world. I've had a lot of people here who do not speak English during my 19 years here, but they have an interpreter. But this year I had 2 ministers from Nigeria. Now I'll take that back. 1 minister and 1 college professor. The ministers spoke the most beautiful English I have ever heard. And I thought, I was born and raised here, and he speaks English better than I do. Of course, here in Kentucky, we cut the I and G and the T-O-N off, but his English was beautiful. But you do meet a lot of interesting people here. Do you have any questions? Because I'm going to find this out.
I understand this building was completed in 1791, but in 1801, August 1801, what still is existing from that meeting?
This church. This
What,
church.
the balcony is included?
Oh, the balcony was already out by 1801. They ain't taken it out, but it is the
So
original
this
balcony.
lower area, all of it was completed by 1801.
Yeah, but the pews were here, see. These pews were still here. But, see, with that many people, it was too small to have the meetings in here. When we celebrated the 200th anniversary of the Great Revival, we had a tent that would seat 1,000 people in our neighbor's yard. And we used this on Sunday morning and had a small service in here, because most of them were that time, and it lasted 8 days instead of 7, in the hottest August I think we've ever had. I thought I was going to die before it was over. So I don't know how hot it was when those poor people had it back in 1801. Well, if you have no questions, I ask 2 things of you.
Good job, Lynn. Good job. think we're gonna make it. I think we're gonna make it. It's been exciting. It's been an exciting, interesting proposition all the way through. And, so, but I'm excited.